We're going to talk a little bit about data, and we're going to talk about pragmatism with measuring data. And I'll talk a little bit, a quick qualification. It was an amazing introduction, by the way. I was impressed with whoever's coming up, but hopefully you'll be equally impressed a half an hour from now. So just a quick background. So I started as a BI guy, building reports, and then I realized that the problem really wasn't with creating reports. The problem was with the structures that you were trying to get the data out of. So I went from being a BI guy to being a data modeler. And then I realized that it's not the models that are the problem, it's the data in the models that's the problem. So I started, and when I became a modeler, I got published a bunch of times in magazines. And then I started being an ETL guy, preparing data. And then I realized that, and I wrote the book because I realized that the ETL, the data preparation, is still the hardest part of the job. And I wrote a book back in 2004, 15 years ago. Some of you may have read it, hopefully. And then around 2009, I realized that dealing with these structures really is not working. So I got into big data and Hadoop and things like that. And I realized that really isn't working either. It's slow, it's not interactive. Then I got into cloud computing and building cloud solutions, building data lakes. And then I realized that, looking at enterprises throughout the US and the world, it's really not, data is not a technical problem anymore. Like, the technology has advanced so much that technically, just looking at the boots outside, how far the technology has advanced, it's not a technical challenge. What's the real challenge now is the people around the data and the culture within an enterprise that is so used to being so heavy-handed with getting things done within an enterprise and the bureaucracy of getting data, getting access to the data. My company, we do machine learning, we do artificial intelligence, we're doing crazy advanced solutions. But at the end of the day, most of our clients, they're like, Joe, just back way up. Like, if I want to get just access to a piece of data, it's like a 3-month process, right? Doing the request, justifying it, giving use cases, like all of this, right? So being able to do all of that and then actually figure out, is there value to it after you go through all that process, it's kind of backwards. So what we did, and for those of you, the last presenter, he mentioned, Gartner's research, probably a half a dozen times or more. So the Gartner researcher that did most of those statistics is actually in the room. So Doug Laney, stand up. So Doug Laney, he's kind of a industry celebrity. He actually left Gartner and he works for Caserta now. And he helped come up with these new approaches of, okay, let's put technology aside for a minute. Let's put the data as as just like transactions aside, and let's look at it a completely different way, right? When we switched from going from big data from traditional data to big data, right? We had to check everything we knew about data, check it at the door, and think about it a new way. So now we're trying to think about it a new way again, and we're trying to think about, let's figure out the value of the data and if it's worth investing in, right? And I think the only way to do that is to really think about it as any other asset, right? So you have an asset in the business. Is this asset, what is the value of this asset? Should we invest more in it? Should we not invest more in it? So let's get into it. So, as a CDO or as, a chief data scientist or a chief dataologist or whatever your title is today, I'm sure you're being asked, we have data. What's the value of this data? Should I invest $1 million in a new platform to store this data? What's the value of getting access to that data quicker? So right now it's a 3-month process. What if it was a 3-day process or a 3-minute process? What's the monetary difference to me as an executive? Right. So what we did is we really put our heads together and we figured out, how would we do that? How would we answer that question and then how would we be able to prove those numbers, right? So what we did is we thought about just basic asset management, right? So in order to monetize any kind of asset, you have to do a few things, right? First, you have to figure out, okay, what's the business plan? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to manage it and govern it? And then what we're going to talk about mostly today is how are you going to measure it, right? And that's the part I think that's been missing. And that's, in every business case says, we want to like speed to value and like lots of words that really have no monetary meaning. So what we did is we took an attempt at actually figuring out how do you monetize or quantify the value of your data. And I just threw this one in for fun. Actually, someone said earlier that it's non-depleting. What's really cool about data is, value is very, very, very valuable. I mean, oil is very valuable, but data, I think, is even more valuable because data can generate new data, and the data that you have can actually create data that's more valuable than the data you have. And then that data is going to create data that's more valuable than the data you just created, right? So if you manage your data correctly, then you can actually make your assets not only grow in value, but grow in value exponentially, right? And that's some of the tools you have, but also coming up with methods of actually doing that measurement is really important. And the bottom line is kind of fun too, that governing data is even more important because it's impossible to clean up after you spill it, right? So we're not going to get into too much of like how do you govern your data, but data governance is one of the key things that we will figure out how to measure the value of governance, right? So there's basically two layers of data valuation. So what we did is we took, if you had a basic asset, right, you basically have the foundational value of your data, the intrinsic value, the business value, and the performance value. And there's hardened calculations that are proven to work. So what we did is we took these calculations and we applied it to using data within your organization. So for intrinsic value, how correct, how complete, how representative is it of your data? So this means that we need to have an ecosystem that can actually cleanse your data, right? Without clean data, and there's books written on like the value of cleaning your data, right? But the valuation and the completeness, and then also is it the scarcity of your data. So taking all of that information, figuring out, so the first time around you probably need a consultant to do it, an expert like Doug or someone from Caserta, or you could try it yourself, but just figuring out, okay, for these variables within your organization, how do I measure this data? The intrinsic value is the basis for most of the other measurements. Once you have the intrinsic value of your data, then you could figure out how valuable is the data to make decisions, right? What is the cost of lost opportunity if we don't use our data to make these decisions, right? So how relevant is our data to current day? And that's why the value does depreciate over time, because as your company evolves, your old data becomes less and less relevant. So the relevancy and your validity and your completeness and your timeliness all gets calculated to come up with a value. Once you have that, then you could figure out how well does it drive new business. So are we actually ringing the cash register with our data? Is it creating new revenue streams? And we can actually use calculations in order to figure that out as well. So once we have the foundation set, then we can figure out the financial value of the data. So what would the cost be if we lost the data, right? Information, and this one I think hits home the most because it helps justify access to data. Because if you have data and you don't have access to it, you may as well not have that data, right? So yeah, they say data storage is cheap, but it's actually really expensive if you can't use it because you're paying for nothing, right? So even if it's a penny that's hitting the bottom line of your business. So the more access you have of your data, the more valuable that data is going to be. And then the market value is what could we get if we sold the data? Quite a bit of our clients now, and the trend in the industry now is to buy third-party data, but also to be able to sell your data. So after you clean it, conform it, consolidate it, come up with and sanitize it, now you can actually make it readily available and sell it for a price. And going through this process, you can come up with a pretty good number of what that price would be, and it can actually move to the other side of the balance sheet. And then the economic value. So how does it contribute to revenue and/or expenses? So there is a cost to doing this, right? And we have to figure out what that cost is. And then there is added revenue based on the opportunities of your data. And doing the math to do that makes it very, very obvious whether it's worth an investment in your data pipeline. So what we did is, once we have the core elements of all of the valuations of your data, now we can actually do something really meaningful. So now we want to figure out, should we be investing, if a consulting firm says, you need a data lake, okay, what's the so what of putting it in a data lake? Does anybody ever say, well, right now your revenue is $3 billion. We can, or 600 million, whatever your revenue is. If you build a data lake, it's going to increase by 3%, by 0.1%, by 20%, right? And put a monetary value on it. I've never seen that done without this type of formal process. So is the investment worth it, right? So coming up with your economic value, your intrinsic value, and doing the math to figure out, should I make this investment? Also, governance. Governance is also key criteria for successful data solutions. Performance value and intrinsic value needs to be considered. And governance also affects not only the availability of it, but really how clean it is and how accurate it is, right? And also being able to measure accuracy and the importance of accuracy depending on what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to sell data to be indicative to make directional decisions, and you find out that it's only about 80% accurate, is that good enough? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But we need to be able to figure that out, right? I think one of the things that this reveals is that the accuracy, once you go over 80 to 90%, depending on what you're trying to do, you kind of get diminishing returns, right? You'll figure out there's so much time spent, holding data back or not using data because it's not 100% accurate. We can't prove that it's 100% accurate. We can't achieve 100% accuracy. But using these methods, you could figure out monetarily that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're making directional decisions. If you're reporting your numbers to Wall Street, that's a different thing. But if you're just trying to get a direction on where you should take your business, if you only have 80% of your data or 70% of your data, it might be good enough. And these methods will reveal exactly, where the point of diminishing return is. It goes on with innovation, monetization, enhanced value, and then the entire life cycle, the expense of keeping your data. Again, if we can actually measure the value of your data over time, and part of the key variable to that measurement is relevance, right? As the relevance starts to deplete, so does the value of your data starts to deplete. So in order to do this, we need to figure out how mature your environment really is. So once we have the basic elements of the data itself, it takes a village, right, to be able to come up with a solution that supports a data environment that is going to help drive the business, right? To be analytics driven, data driven, but we want to be able to say, okay, conventional wisdom is not scalable anymore. There's only so many brains in the room. We need to have data and machines to actually be able to drive our business, right? I think that's unargued at this point, right? But in order to do that, it takes a very big cultural shift, typically, unless you're a startup from the ground up with this philosophy. But if you're from a legacy enterprise, more than 10, 15, 20 years old, you probably have to start doing some shifting. And it includes culture and executive leadership and strategy and communication, but also the metrics. What exactly are we measuring in order to figure out whether our data is actually working for us, right? I think we've been, those of us who are like data folks, who I think everybody in this room is, we've been working for data for a really long time, right? And I think there comes an inflection point, and it goes from like being working class to being, more affluent. Once we have a certain level of money, we start trying to make our money work for us rather than us just working to make money. And I think when you have a certain amount of data of value, you have to have that inflection point. Stop working for your data and make your data start working for you. And part of that is trying to figure out how do you measure the value of that. And using these techniques, it seems to be working. It's going to take a little bit of reorganization, new skills, architecture and integration. It needs to be readily available. It needs to be interactive. If you have a new idea on how to generate new revenue using your data, it cannot be a 6-month project. We need an environment that can actually allow you to have, I really liked, I never knew the product, what was it, Data Rocket or something? Answer Rocket, yeah, Answer Rocket. Looks cool. I'll investigate it after this. But yeah, something like that where we can have very quick speed to value. I do believe that the future of data includes nothing more than a search bar, or even nothing more than just a chatbot. We should be able, by now, we should be able to just go into any machine within our company or our phone and say, what were my sales yesterday? And it should just know. And we shouldn't care about what system is it coming from, what table is it coming from, what column is it, what's the calculation, like all of that. I mean, come on now, we're going to be in 2020 in a couple of months. Like, this has to evolve. And I think the reason it hasn't yet, as he showed in the last demonstration, it's not a technical challenge. It's our culture. It's proving that investment is worth making. Right? And this is really the only way we could figure out how to prove that value. So governance and quality, making sure your data is right, and then being able to deploy iteratively and having the correct technology also is always important. So what we also did is we said, okay, so now that we have those measurements of data and how to monetize it, now we need to figure out, looking at the rest of your organization, how mature is your environment to actually start leveraging data in a real way, right? In a real significant way, and stop making your, investing millions and millions of dollars to create a better report. Right? We need to really turn our environments into a smart company, right? A smart company where we can just, open up our phone and say, what were my sales yesterday? Who was my best salesman yesterday? What are our sales going to be tomorrow based on the current climate in the industry, right? We should be able to do that. And so what we do is we came up with a bunch of indicators that measure the maturity of your entire organization. And we do it department by department, and we can actually measure which parts of your industry are more mature than others, and then aggregate it to come up with an overall score. And if you're somewhere between 3 and 4, or even 2 and 3, you're doing pretty okay, right? But the goal is to always keep achieving, right? To have something that is well-defined and well-managed, and be able to ultimately optimize your data ecosystem so that you can be a mature, data-driven, analytics-driven environment. So in order to achieve it, right, this model has over 200 indicators across those 8 dimensions that I mentioned. And so what you can do is you can go through your organization and ask these very hard questions. Questions like, how is the culture? Like, if we were to build it, would they come? Right? Or is the culture so conventional wisdom driven that we can have the greatest engine in the world, no one's going to get in that car, right? Because they're used to walking their way, or they're just comfortable with their jalopy and they don't want a car that they're not used to, right? So understanding culture, understanding communication, understanding your technology, this is all part of figuring out the maturity of the data within your organization. And then once you have that baseline, then you can come up with a plan to figure out how to get your enterprise more mature. And you can do this scoring periodically, annually, quarterly, whatever your goals are, right? And this way, if we go back here, if you come in at, say, a 2.8 overall score, and you could make a goal to say, we want to be at level 4 by 2021, right? And we can create a very concrete roadmap on how to get there, on how to mature your environment so that you could start monetizing your data in a very significant way. So I'll just finish up with, data innovations may fail, but organizations that don't innovate will fail. It is not an option. It's not optional anymore. It is mandatory in today's climate to invest in your data ecosystem, to invest in changing your culture, to revolve around your data, evolve. Harmonize, analyze, monetize. So this just goes through the life cycle of the approach. So have a vision. I think everybody in the room here is probably responsible for the vision of what your company is going to do with your data. Once you have that vision, come up with concrete action next steps. Figure out how to measure it. We went over that already. Apply data governance. Really look at your organization and think about, is your organization really fit, right, to support and grow an analytics-driven company, right? Not the analytics team, right, but the entire organization. Is the entire organization really ready? Like, if you had a litmus test for your company to say, are we really ready to be an analytics-driven company? Would it pass that litmus test? And if not, no matter how great of a data scientist you are, no matter how great the algorithms that you build are, no matter how great your data quality is, it's really not going to matter, right? I think the organization and the roles is probably the people part, right? Change management, disruption management. This is really critical in order to be successful in today's climate. Architecture and technology, of course, if the engine doesn't work, no matter how great the cockpit feels, you're not going to go anywhere, right? So investing in current technology also is important. So just a quick, Caserta is a consulting firm. We've been around 18 years. We've gone through this entire evolution. We've been ahead of the curve for most of this vision and change over the last 2 decades. We provide strategic advisory services, business transformation consulting, cloud data strategy, advanced technical solutions, any problem. We're usually the SWAT team that parachutes in when there's something needs to be done and you just can't figure out how to do it. That's when you call Caserta. Data management and governance techniques and methods, and then also data science, ML, and AI. And I think that's it. So thank you.